Hey everybody, it's Ryan. I'm a former F-15E combat pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and current commercial pilot. Today I'll be breaking down the tragic incident that happened in DC with the Black Hawk hitting the CRJ. I'll give you my perspective and opinion from being a commercial pilot and also having operated in the military around helicopters. So combining fast movers with helicopters, deconfliction, and what I just think happened in this situation and how we can avoid it moving forward. So let's watch the video and I'll start with the breakdown there. So what we're gonna see is from the left-hand side, right here we have the Black Hawk coming in. You have the CRJ in the center with that bright light. That's because they're coming in to land, so they have their landing light on, so their light is much brighter. The helicopter is going to have less lighting, but it does have some lighting, and that's just required by regulations to operate in US airspace, but their lights are not very bright. So on the right side of the CRJ, the first officer is going to be the one that picks up, likely the one that picks up the aircraft, the Black Hawk coming in, and that ultimately hits it. The NTSB has said that last second the pilots did try to pull up, and that checks with what we're going to see here in a second. But likely what happened was a little bit of rush coming from those lights coming in from the right-hand side. Just my opinion, likely the first officer is going to be the one to pick up this Black Hawk. But when you're coming in on an approach as a commercial pilot, you're really focused out front because you've deconflicted and you're in a piece of airspace that feels like the most sacred piece of airspace there is, because the tower has deconflicted it, you have approach control deconflicting it, and you have basically this piece of airspace where you are very vulnerable. So you're coming in to land and you're configured, so that means your flaps are out, your gear are down, so you can't really maneuver very much. So you're kind of expecting everyone else to give way to you. And that's what likely these pilots are feeling when they hear the Black Hawk say they have the traffic in sight and they request visual separation. We'll get to the audio here in a second. Likely what's gonna happen in-game, the pilot's gonna get rushed from the Black Hawk. It might have blended in with cultural lighting to begin with, but then in-game with the river underneath, the first officer maybe transitioning outside to the right and seeing that streak of light, and then one of the pilots pulling up in-game trying to avoid. The Black Hawk's gonna hit underneath to about the left wing, and it's gonna turn the CRJ into a tumble, and the Black Hawk is gonna continue straight through. Tragically, we'll watch the rest of the video. So there's the impact. You can see the Black Hawk continue through, and the CRJ is tumbling in, unfortunately. And then boom, another angle. Yeah, so it looks to me like the impact's gonna happen somewhere around 300 feet. At the beginning of the video, we've got about probably 350, 400 feet in the CRJ. Impact's gonna happen at about 300 feet. And what we're hearing from the NTSB initially is that the helicopter was high, that there were deconfliction corridors created where they would stay underneath 200 feet. And that's what I saw in Afghanistan and combat situations as well. You're gonna have the aircrafts that are rotary wings stay extremely low to deconflict. Even when we would do shows of force down really low, 400, 500 feet, we would make sure that all helicopters in the area were underneath 200 feet, or maybe sometimes underneath 100 feet. That obviously didn't happen in this situation. Why didn't it happen? This is just a guess, is that maybe there was some instruction going on. Maybe it was just losing track of the contracts because the pilots in the Black Hawk had a different aircraft in sight, and they think they've got this massive swath of clear airspace in front of them. If you're on night vision goggles, that's gonna be blinding. That's gonna be unmissable. So I don't know yet if these Black Hawk pilots were for sure on night vision goggles or not, but ultimately, if they were, that light's gonna be super visible, and if they weren't, that light's gonna be relatively visible as well. You can see how bright that was. So deconfliction contracts are massive. They're huge. You have to adhere to them. So I want to show you now a aircraft crash that happened at a Dallas air show. This is during the daytime, and this is what can happen when an aircraft doesn't adhere to certain contracts and they don't see an aircraft that they don't know is there. So this is going to kind of just cue you in to kind of how this would look in the daytime. This is a fixed wing hitting a fixed wing aircraft, but I think it's valuable for us to see what happens when deconfliction contracts aren't met. Coming in from the left to right will be a fighter, and it's going to hit a bomber. Tragically, that's going to end in disaster as well. But as you can see, when an aircraft is looking at something else, or they aren't sure of what's right in front of them, they don't know what's underneath their belly, they're in a position where their attention is focused somewhere else. If you're focused only on your instruments, so if you're only looking at the instruments, that could happen as well. Now let's listen to the communications between the tower and the different aircraft that were involved in the incident.
789 contact so far, good day. Okay. American 3130 for the final. Well, American 3130. Pass 25, traffic just off the Wilson Bridge to CRJ at 1,200 feet, start runway 33.
has a check inside request visual separation.
It's separation approved.
Okay, so you can hear the tower call out 3130. So the call sign 3130. That aircraft is going to be behind 5342, which 5342 is the CRJ involved in the incident. And then Pat 25 is the helicopter that just says they want visual separation from the aircraft and they have the aircraft in sight. I believe they had 3130 in sight, not 5342. For whatever reason, 5342 might be low enough to where it's almost co-altitude or just slightly above. So it almost looks like that's lights from the city, it's cultural lighting, or it's way far away. And at night, depth perception can be off, especially if you're in night vision goggles or just anytime at night. Sometimes it's really hard to determine what's closer to you and what's further away. So I believe Pat 25 is going to see 3130. Let's continue.
5 has a check inside request visual separation.
It's separation approved. American 1630 tower, runway 1 off wood, traffic through Alpha, runway 33, dispatch 16 off funnel. Runway 1. Please keep 6307. Keep rolling down to November, South 47 today. American 1630 to 1 star 32014, Duck 25. Traffic 2 mile left base from runway 33. No delay, runway 1 clear for immediate takeoff. Number 1, clear for takeoff, American 1630.
Okay, now I want you to cue in on 5342. You can see their altitude is showing up as 600 feet. Pat 25's altitude is 200 feet, but altimeters can be off by roughly 75 feet. You can still be legal to fly. So they might be a little bit high, but it is showing up as 200 feet on this video now. If you look at the altitude of 5342, it is decreasing because they're on final approach. They're setting themselves up to then land on runway 33. All right, right there. That question right there is huge because they're going to get a tower alert of a collision warning. So the tower is going to hear that, and then they're going to confirm. They're going to ask, do you have the CRJ in sight? Now you can see Pat 25's altitude right now is climbing. So they went up slightly. So they're going to be 300 feet, but again, it could be a little bit higher, could be a little bit lower. Ultimately, this is the situation developing where contracts aren't being met. Likely they were supposed to stay below 200 feet. That will be determined later. Again, this is just unofficial, in my opinion. But if the contract was 200 feet, now Pat 25 is in a position where they're essentially co-altitude and they're not seeing this aircraft that's right in front of them because they're looking at the aircraft behind them, 3130.
Pat 25, pass behind this CRJ.
Pat 5 has a aircraft inside request visual separation.
Good separation.
So the tower is just going to confirm pass behind the CRJ. But there's multiple aircraft out there. Pat 25, it's really hard to know who they actually had in sight. And this is where you kind of have to build contracts as pilots so that things can operate and happen with the current technology that we have, where you just have to trust that this pilot has the actual aircraft in sight. And they're so close that you would assume they would have that in sight. But again, at night, sometimes it's really hard to determine that. And then things are happening really tight. So they get that traffic warning and the tower is going to confirm that Pat 25 has that aircraft in sight. But then at the end, he's going to say, visual step approved. He's going to say it really quick because he's like, dude, you guys are right next to each other, essentially co-altitude. And passing behind an aircraft at co-altitude like this close, just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, ultimately, I think you need like a half-mile bubble, which would be about 3,000 feet. Tell the helicopter to stop, but that's not the procedure, right? That's not what's been done for years. So you can't blame the tower controller for that. But obviously something needs to change. Some rules need to change because just pass behind, there's certain regulations that you're supposed to adhere to, 1,000 feet. But in this situation, in a critical situation like this, where you might not know what aircraft they're talking about, we need deconfliction contracts that are better.
American 4782 by Pat, for visual. American 472, Washington, 1 star, 32017.
So there's the impact, and you're going to hear the controllers in the tower react. I mean, they're human beings just like the rest of us, so they're going to react to seeing that, and they probably know right away what happened.
Did you see that? American 472. American 3130, go around, turn left in 250, climb maintain 3000.
So American 3130 is going to be behind that incident. They're at 800 feet. They're going to have probably one of the best views of that. I really want to give credit to this main controller in the tower, though, because he's going to continue to do his job, even though the hair in the back of his neck standing up, he knows something tragic has happened. And he's going to tell American 3130 to go around, turn left heading 350, 3000. And he's very aware that even though a tragedy just happened, we got to make sure that everybody else is safe. We don't want to make a bad situation worse. So really good good job there. Hats off for continuing to do his job really well. What a tragedy. But I want to talk to you about likely what happened. And I'm just going to give you my perspective, my opinion of being an aviator. So we'll start with the visual separation. So the way that visual separation works, it's how you continue to keep things moving. I mean, if right now with the current technology, if you had to have instrument clearances or corridors for no one to cross flight paths, it would be really tough. It'd be really tough to continue to allow aviation to function in the way that it does. However, let's talk about a situation like with cars. Okay, so with your normal average everyday car, sometimes you're sitting at an intersection and people will pull out in front of another car because they don't see it. Whatever the reason is, there's parts of the vehicle blocking it. The car blends in with the background. I mean, who knows? But ultimately, something I've thought of is when you're in a Tesla and you're sitting there and it's on autopilot, the Tesla's not going to pull out in front of another car, likely, because it's got all this technology and all these cameras around it that are showing you, nope, I'm not going to pull out. And so there's updates that should probably happen to aircraft. Now that is a very expensive upgrade. We're probably years away from something like that happening, like cameras being able to automatically deconflict you in situations like this. But there are certain things in aircraft that will give you alert warnings. But when you're coming in to land like that, you're that low of altitude, it's tricky because you don't want to give an aircraft a command that puts it into the ground, because sometimes there'll be commands when you're up at altitude that'll tell you to descend to avoid a collision, and you just follow the box. It's really easy to do and it's awesome. The technology is great. But when you're low to the ground, it can be difficult because you don't want to put an aircraft in a position where you force it to descend and then it crashes into the ground. Next, let's talk about the corridor. So this corridor obviously needs to change and shift. And it needs to change and shift in a way where maybe it's laterally deconflicted as well. So right now it's altitude deconflicted, the 200 feet, where they believe that the airliners are not going to cross into that 200-foot zone. But obviously there needs to be some sort of lateral deconfliction and to give more of an altitude deconfliction from the helicopters and fixed wing. And then next would be see and avoid procedures, just doubling down, pilots doubling down on making sure they're seeing the aircraft that they actually see, especially at night when it's really hard to determine who's who. Thanks for watching the video, guys. Please subscribe to the channel and we'll see you on the next one.